the other thing, is that Gibran, whatever we think about him, I think a lot of Naima stuff is far superior to Gibran. That doesn't matter. I mean, in the end, Gibran became so big that I think that's what happened, I think, to a lot of this stuff too, is that in the States, Arab-American author, Gibran. You know, and so that's probably another thing that is, helped keep this less known.
But my argument is that, at least in the case of the book of Khalid, it has some special themes that I think would be appropriate for certainly university students and high school students to enter into curriculum that the Prophet doesn't give you. And the most important is this Arab-American immigration theme, which is something that I think is very important, that people are aware of the history of this immigration, how fundamental it was, and this novel is a fictionalization of it in a very vivid way, and especially has themes that are relevant to all ethnic groups. And the other thing is, Rihani should also be forwarded as simply as an important political figure. I mean, he is a symbol of what I consider to be sort of the original promise of the Arab-American relationship. And so it's of my opinion that if we looked at some of his statements as quotations, they could inspire us as we work to repair the damage that's been done.
Yeah, no, I mean, I certainly agree. It would be nice if you were better known, but I think just all these factors have helped. I mean, there's
and literary reputation has contingencies to it. That's the other thing. It's a strange beast. Merit is not the only factor at work. There's a lot of personalities, and there's sociological theory of sort of reputational entrepreneurs, actually, that there needs to be institutions who forward people's reputations in order for them to be bought into it. So that's part of sort of the mission of this project, is to say, look, if we can take the 100th anniversary of the first Arab-American novel, a historical event, clearly, and raise awareness of this figure who has important lessons for today's world, then we might be able to work to correct some of these reputational crimes.
Michael, how did he make a living, and both in America and in Lebanon?
Yes, I mean, he's interesting in that way. He's sort of a Luftmensch, in his own way. He was writing. I mean, I've gone through his correspondence, and he's doing things like a lot throughout his life. He's selling articles, travel writings about the Middle East to things like Asia Magazine, these Orientalist publications in New York. And he wrote a lot of it. I mean, he's very prolific, even with these literary works and all the political engagement. He's constantly churning out pieces, and they're not just bad quality. I mean, a piece that he would do on like the Ashura events or the Arabian Tales would be nights. It would be much 1001 Nights. He did this long piece on that, which is brilliant. Would be very, very well written. So he would write poetry for things. He would also later in life he did some university tours of the United States. He was involved also in Arabian horse trading. I don't know how much income he got, but he spent a lot of his time in the Middle East, where I'm sure expenses were lower in his home. But he had some patrons, but I don't think he was not a wealthy man. He really did, and that's another thing, is he had this potential to take advantage of his situation. He could have been working for the U.S. government. A lot of people believed, there's still I encounter people who actually believe that his travels through the Arabian Peninsula in the 1920s, there's still this theory that he was an agent of the U.S. government. But there's absolutely no evidence for that. He really was a very pure, moral, a person who saw himself as completely independent. He was sort of a state unto himself, of representing good, representing anti-sectarianism and Arab unity and nationalism, and a very incredible figure. Somebody who we would be praying for today.
Is there a collected edition of his writings?
No, that would be a long-term goal, I would hope, of my work with him. I mean, I think it's a shame that there isn't. But there fortunately, his nephew, Dr. Ameen Rihani, who's at Notre Dame University in Lebanon, has done a good job of publishing his work and his papers. So they have a lot of different editions in Arabic and English that you can find. But the one problem is that because they're published in Lebanon, because they're not in have distribution in the United States. So it would be nice someday to find some press who'd
And
like.
is there, I think I know the answer, but is there a study of this group of writers that he was an example to, of these Najjar writers?
Yes.
Yeah, there's quite a few. As a matter of fact, Nadim Naimi, Mikhail Naimi's nephew, among other things he's written, wrote a book, a really nice, very small book. It was SUNY Press or something, called The Lebanese Prophets of New York City or something along those lines. And Rihani,
Right.
and it's interesting what you were saying before, because he names the three he talks about are Ameen Rihani, Mikhail Naimi, his uncle, and Gibran. And he names them the forerunner, I think he calls Ameen Rihani, the prophet and the prophet in something or other. It's all quite highfalutin terms. But anyway, and yeah, the first chapter is on Ameen Rihani, and he acknowledges him as a forerunner figure, as did all the other.
And I think, and to some degree also, since September 11th, there has been a bit of a return to Ameen Rihani. There was a conference at American University in 2002, organized by the Ameen Rihani Institute, that gathered some of the leading scholars around the world. And I think just because of the degree to which he was crucial to our American relationship, people are naturally interested in him again. So. For instance, there's actually just a month ago there's a new volume called "The Politics and Poetics of Ameen Rihani," published by Nijme Hajar of University in Australia, which uses his literary work as sort of a basis to establish his entire political program, not only dealing with Arab nationalism, his dealings with the French, his concept of Syrian nationalism versus Lebanese nationalism, his social program. He really was a complete political philosopher in a sense, and this work really emphasizes that his life is much more than just the literary work, which is tremendous in its own life. Yes.
I apologize if you've already addressed this. I had a class, but how was this novel received when it came out in?
That's a good point. It was published in by Todd, Mead and Company, I think about 3,000 copies, and it was. I think it was just ahead of its time. I mean, Irfan Sheet, others have said that this novel really, when it was written, could not have been comprehended by anybody on the planet except for him, because it uses both Arabic terminology throughout. It takes place half in New York and half in Lebanon. I mean, I think his friends and people who knew him in New York, most of them seemed to think it was a great novel, and it got good reviews when it was reviewed. But I think it went under the radar. It was marketed as an attempt to really to just have what's the immigrants' take on New York City, but it just I don't think it really fit any niche. So it didn't really catch on. So the 1911 edition was published, and there really wasn't much of an echo from it. And this was his last, major novel. So that's part of the problem. I mean, the literary reputation of a work is often dependent. If the work is not a major success at the time of its publication, then it will have to be revisited at some time. And I don't think this work has ever had that sort of revisiting moment that has caused it to enter the canon or what it says.
Did he ever show any interest in getting into politics?
Into American politics? Yeah, that's a good question. He was very careful about that. I mean, one thing, he became an American citizen, I guess when he was like around 30 or so. And then he married an American, which also complicated that. And of course, he was Maronite Christian. So he was very active in politics in the sense that he was part of these committees that were established to advocate for the Syrian national cause. He did things like he even advocated during World War I that the American Syrians and Syrians in the diaspora, volunteer to join the French forces and things like that. But I don't think he ever took seriously the idea of getting involved in Lebanese politics. And under the situation, it would have been difficult for him to be a leader. I don't know. He had said blasphemous things at various times. There are a lot of, you know, he's like American politics. If you wanted to really, you know, he was connected to everybody. So if you wanted to tear him down, it would have been easy. So I think he stayed out of the public life. But you know, he was a man of the people too. I mean, he as I said, he really really sympathized with the poor and with the victims of imperialism, and he pretty much kept true to his values. So I think, you know, in another scenario, you know, today he would be like the Hamid Karzai or the Shalabi, right? Maybe arguably, you know, if the United States got involved, he was sort of the point man, but he was never corrupted, and so that's the difference.
You know, I'm sorry, I've been racking my brains trying to remember this quote. There's a famous quote of him saying something like, "I'd sell all the poetry of the East for, you know, airplanes from the West," or something like this. And this is sort of where I think he's best known, you know, amongst Arab writers today. So how do you...
Yeah, he has a pretty wry sense of humor, and so I could imagine that being in a particular context. There's a collection that may be from the Path of Vision. I'm not sure. Well,
it's quoted in, you know, I think Ibrahim Jabra quoted
right.
him as saying this.
Well, yes. So one of his major points was that education was a huge theme for him. He felt that the Eastern world, or that the Arab world, really should follow Western education, should embrace science and technology. And actually one of the key themes in the book of Khalid is that religion and modern education don't conflict. And one of the proofs of that is the United States, because the United States, more than Europe, was successfully able to allow religion to coexist with modern education. But yes, I could see him saying that as a sort of a wry comment. But the man is a poet, so he does not disparage poetry. I think that he said that, you know, that both are important, both progress are important, and that would, in that time, that would be the way that they would achieve their freedom and their independence, would be to have their own trade and their own industry. He was very worried about the imperialism, the British and French imperialism, preventing them from creating their own industry, which would mean that they would be independent. The only way that the nationalist project would succeed would be if they had education and industry.
Yeah, but I don't think this is just industry he's interested in. He's interested in
actually,
weapons
you know,
of war.
well, no, and actually, it's funny that you talk about planes and things, because I was in Najjar's book. One of the things he was worried about in the 20s and 30s was about too much imported technology coming into Lebanon. He didn't like the idea of having too many people relying on cars and planes because of the foreign exchange deficit. And for military, I think he wanted the Arab kings to be able to hold their own against the imperialists. I mean, I even saw it, for instance. I think, you know, he thought that they could potentially figure out a way to all the kings to unify and to create an Arab state, which would have, you know, but that was the view at the time. Who knows what history would be like if that project had succeeded? But certainly, you know, there was a military component to that. So that's not evil. People fighting for their freedom, I think. So.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.